certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spiers, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
WA gripped by fear.
All members of Western Australia have got a responsibility because these are our daughters and sisters.
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
It was a time when an entire city was gripped with fear. A serial killer on the loose, abducting young women from a buzzing and popular night spot. Hi and welcome to this bonus episode of Claremont in Conversation. I'm Natalie Bongiolo, and in the studio with criminal lawyer Damien Cripps and Australia's most experienced court reporter, Alison Fan. Ali, before these murders in the late 1990s, how would you have described Claremont back then?
Claremont was a very safe neighbourhood. It was a very conservative neighbourhood and a very affluent neighbourhood. Just down the road you had Millionaires Row, where you had Australia's richest families living. You had the Alan Bond, Kerry Stokes, Gina Reinhardt, Lang Hancock, all living within a few blocks away. Everybody knew everybody. There were mainly 4 private schools in the area. You felt very, very safe going into Claremont, and there was absolutely no fear of anything of the outside world touching it.
And it was it's quite close to the beach, so there's a lot of pubs by the beach side, and there's this little strip which is a really vibrant night spot, and it's where all sorts of people congregate, not just people from who lived in the area, but everybody went there and went to the pubs and the clubs, and it was really popular.
John Sankin turned that area into a very trendy area. He had both the Continental and the Club Bayview, which he started up, which was quite different from anything. Northbridge, you had Northbridge, but then you had this very trendy Club Bayview, which you could go to at 2 a.m. and stay there, and it drew a lot of people into Claremont. But again, it was always regarded as a very safe, college-type atmosphere, kids walking up and down Bayview Terrace. And unlike Northbridge, which was starting to gain a bit of a rough reputation, you felt safe in Claremont.
Damien, were you out pubbing and clubbing in Claremont back then?
I grew up outside of the city, but once I'd moved to the city, I was across the river in Applecross. In the Applecross area was where I was living at the time, which I'd say, Ali, wasn't such a different sort of area. It was quite affluent, and there was a lot of well-to-do people in that area. And what we would do, me and all my friends, we would venture to Fremantle or to Perth. But it was interesting when I was just listening to Ali then, I specifically recall that Tuesdays and Fridays, for some reason, we would end up in Claremont. I don't know why that is. If you think where Applecross geographically is located, it's quite a taxi-wise, it's quite a hike to get around there. But I remember that there was a great band that played at the Continental called the Never Never that we religiously went on Tuesday nights to see. And then I think that the Club Bayview had a great reputation Friday and Saturday nights. So there was this magnificent draw to that area from all over the city. And it was a great night out. It really was.
And you could bump into all sorts of people, couldn't you? You know, if you went to Claremont, you could bump into uni students. There were travellers, footballers.
Footballers, especially down at Club Bayview.
Footballers particularly would hang out at Club Bayview. If you wanted to spot an Eagles player, that's where you would go.
But I remember too, now you've just brought something back, they had what they called Suits Night on a Friday, where the suits, the so-called young lawyers and professionals used to come down there. So others who didn't want to mix with a suits guy wouldn't go on a Friday or Thursday. I remember there was a specific night.
Subsets because when you would go.
Well, both my sons were in their 20s, and so they were there every other night.
So just to put people in the picture who aren't from Western Australia, Claremont is in the western suburbs on the coast, and if you were to head further south, 10 minutes, you would hit Fremantle, and then across the river to the other side, if you headed backwards, you'd be heading east, and that would take you to Applecross and sort of heading to the eastern suburbs out there. So just that's where it is location-wise.
And now, of course, it's become the scene of one of the worst serial killings in the world.
So it really changed, I guess, in 1996 when Sarah disappeared. Do you recall that event, Ali?
Oh, totally. It became a very fearful place. It became a fearful place for the parents. I don't think it changed much for those clubbing there, because I remember the kids would come around to our place and then they'd go down in a group and then they'd come back and crash there, and I thought the girls didn't seem to worry about it, but that's an age where they think it's probably as risky as being hit by a comet. You know, they just don't worry about stuff like that.
Yeah.
The parents were totally spooked. Older women were spooked. They thought they were going to get snatched off the streets of Claremont, and it was just a paranoia, just whole feeling it changed the neighbourhood completely. And since then, it's now still known as Claremont, has now got a different intonation as far as what it means. Yeah.
Do you remember that time?
Well, my recollection's a little bit different in that perhaps I was coming from the other side of the river. I recall that when these incidents had taken place, going out remained the same for me and my friends. We still would go out and we'd behave in the same way, but I think, as I might have discussed with you previously, Nat, that I certainly recall thinking momentarily, albeit, that from time to time I could potentially be viewed as somebody who was a potential perpetrator of those the people going missing. But, I mean, at that time, I want to say I was 18 or 19. It could be the case that I was 23 or 24. I mean, look, I was... back then I was a very chatty person, and I would talk to people on a whim on the street, in a club, at an ATM, and I don't think that ever changed for me, but I certainly can appreciate what Ellie's saying, that it did change for a lot of people.
Only the older people. I don't think it changed for your generation at all, because they were still clubbing. Girls were still walking around. In fact, I remember one of my son's girlfriends coming back, and I thought the only reason you haven't been picked up is because they think you're a police trap, because she was walking around hitchhiking with her shoes off, wandering down at 2 a.m. down Claremont. They didn't care at all, the kids at that age. They're invincible at that age.
Well, I was in my mid-20s at the time, and my friends lived in that area. I didn't live in the area. I lived up in the hills, but like you were saying, you know, a 45-minute
still
trek
went down there
all the way to Club Bayview. And I remember still going there. It didn't stop me going there, but I was scared and I was worried. Yeah, definitely. And I was terrified about catching a taxi.
Yes, because that was because the police brought the taxi industry into it all by where they're calling them forward to give their DNA. And I keep going on and on about this at podcast, but if they'd only mentioned Telstra, that you would have immediately been alerted to a white van with a Telstra. Everybody who drove a white van, and you're talking about as a guy, I know people were picked up left and right. That's why there's such widespread interest. So many guys who are in their 20s that drove a white van were stopped and questioned.
Yeah.
So this wonderful little city of ours, that people who live here, we all love it so much, and people around the globe come to know Perth for different reasons. They travel here, they have a story, they see a movie, whatever the case may be. But one thing that I think stamps a Perth person is that we're so friendly. We're always so forward to talk to people, and whenever I travel, and if I run into someone and I speak to them about their encounters with Perth, they always say that the Perth people are extremely friendly. And it's interesting hearing you ladies discuss that, you know, especially Nat, you say that it was a bit different for you around that time coming down into the area because you were a bit reluctant to travel in the taxi or whatever. And I wonder how much that had an impact on the persona of Perth people globally at that time. Like I said, I don't think it affected me. I was pretty happy to keep talking and chatting away, but I'm sure a lot of people, it actually did draw them back a little bit.
Yeah, I think so. And it was just that sense of, you know, it went from being a very safe place where you could just walk around any time of the day or night, you never thought anything of it, to this place where, you know, if my girlfriend decided she was going to leave the club, well, I'm grabbing her arm and saying, no, we've all got to leave together. We're going together. And I remember always feeling like I then needed to be in a pack for safety, and I would never have then, after that, walked off on my own because I was worried.
Do you think, given your experience in journalism and your working in the media industry, do you think that changed your view of the way you could conduct yourself in public and went out and about forever?
Not really. It was almost like this, because I wasn't in the media back then, but it was almost like this, it was like Claremont had become this bubble. And I probably would have gone to Northbridge, jumped in a cab and gone home by myself from Northbridge. It was Claremont that was the concern.
Yeah, I think also too, people were trying to work out what sort of a car would these girls get into without hesitating. They obviously wouldn't get into somebody that it looked, you know, freakish or scary. And so that's why everyone said, oh, well, a taxi is the one thing you jump into regardless of who's driving, without even thinking. And that was why the taxi industry came under great suspicion at the time.
There was a real change not long after these girls had gone missing, in that Northbridge became popular.
Yeah.
And obviously you can't pinpoint the fact that this had anything to do with the downturn perhaps in Claremont, but there was certainly around the 2000s an increase in the popularity of Northbridge as a night spot.
Yeah.
That's right, yes, absolutely.
And I think it wasn't just for our generation. So, people from that time, obviously, they then passed those fears onto their kids. So you have these young people today who, prior to hearing about an arrest and hearing much about Claremont, also had this notion and a sense of, well, if you're going to Claremont for the night, you better be careful. And this is decades later.
Well, those clubs are no longer there. The Conti or Claremont's taken on a completely different look now. Club Bayview's not there.
Well, it's there, but it's a different name.
Yes, but it doesn't have the same attraction. No. They are going into Northbridge.
It's still a good night spot. It's a fantastic
night
spot.
I'm there every night. They're not taking me off the street.
The restaurants, the bars, the people, it's a great night spot. But as you said, Nat, you put a story or an environment like this into people's psyche, it will actually have an impact, understandably, an impact on how they move and travel through a city.
And I think, the media campaigns or the police campaigns and, celebrities who were warning people, Lisa McCune at the time.
Oh, it was very heavy, yes.
Isla Fisher, there was even Kate Sobrano at one point, and there was these TV advertisements, wasn't there, where they were saying, trust your head or something along those lines, don't take risks. Do you remember Lisa McCune's TV commercial?
But their messages that
they were at the time, though, right at the very time.
Yes, yes.
And they stand the test of time. I mean, it's not a bad warning to heed to people on any day. Just use your head about what you're going to do, and that's by no means an insinuation that these girls that have gone missing weren't using their head. I mean,
no.
We're living in a different time. I got into cars with people all of the time.
Yeah.
I hitchhiked. If I needed to go and see my parents in Northampton, I would I'd get out to Midland and I'd stand on the highway. It was a different time. I would never do that now. It's just a completely different time, wasn't it?
Yeah. Ali, you were, at the time, you worked, extensively on these cases. You were quite close to the police. You were quite close to the families. What was it like in that situation back then?
Oh, traumatic, especially with the Spiers family. He never gave up looking. And then the Glennon family, especially Dennis Glennon, was very, very proactive after Ciara was found murdered. He poured money into making Claremont a safer place. He made sure that he took on the council, that they put in more lighting, more security cameras. He poured money into the police investigation in various ways. Very, very proactive in trying to change the whole environment of Claremont. I think he still said to me just not long ago, he still can't drive through Claremont.
Yeah.
It's just somewhere that he lives in Mosman Park. He used to work in the city. He said he still can't drive through that area. And I don't think anybody drives through without looking at that particular corner where you are now identifying exactly where they disappeared from. It's totally changed the area. As I said, it was a very college. You had private schools. Everybody vaguely knew everybody and felt safe there. And that completely changed.
Yeah.
But the Dennis Glennon was very, very proactive in changing that. At one stage we had a Claremont mayor under suspicion, but he made sure that everything was made safer in Claremont. And that was the last of it. I mean, we never heard any more after that, which is why, of course, that public servant who was under suspicion distracted, I think, the investigation completely.
And you, of course, had a very extensive and lengthy interview with him. He invited you in.
Yes.
And you came away with a really strong sense.
Yes. He was definitely odd, but a very trusting, submissive person who was anxious to talk about everything, including his lie detector thing that he took, and he said, well, they asked me a question, have I hurt anybody? I had to say, yes, I hurt my 6-year-old sister when we were, or brother when we were kids. So,
and we're just talking here about Lance Williams,
yes,
who was a public servant. Police focused their attention on him, and this
followed
was
him 24/7
for many years. That's right. They parked across the road from his house. They would follow him to work. They'd follow him back from work. He really was hounded for many, many years.
And I think, too, some of the descriptions we're hearing now about various people who got into a white sedan and had a lift could have been Lance Williams, because he was a very odd, compulsive person, and he did admit to driving around Claremont, trying to look for women who he thought were in danger and actually driving them places.
Ali, just that spiked my memory about something. I was aware that you had interviewed Mr. Williams extensively. And it serves as a great reminder to us that we are innocent until proven guilty.
Totally.
Yeah.
And we have to keep going back to that. We keep harping on it. And if you go and sit in a court case, you'll hear judges and lawyers harp on about it. Given your interaction with Mr. Williams at the time and the time that has passed now, does it make you cautious about your view of the current accused man? Does it affect your...
I'm starting to look at things like a defence lawyer would, and beyond reasonable doubt, and so far I have not seen anything that actually puts Bradley Edwards at the scene. We've had varying descriptions of cars, right from one extreme to the other, to yesterday a Ford ute with a canopy over the top from the same time as an eyewitness, and he insists that there was someone there holding a tailgate. We are now waiting for the forensic, the DNA, but at the moment, as they would say, there is certainly no smoking gun.
No.
And even though I think a jury might think differently, because they would be influenced by the rape case, which was very, very violent, quite horrific. But looking at this case separately, there's nothing that I see there as yet.
So, Ali, just in relation to that, a lot of the listeners would be interested, I think, given that you're a person who interviewed Lance and was working so close at hand at the time back then, with all that you've just explained then about what your thoughts are just at the moment, do you think that they would have been different had we not had the Lance Williams experience back in 1997?
No.
No, so because it's interesting, as I said, it's a constant reminder to us that there are people that get put in the firing line of suspicion.
Well, if they start to, it's a bit like Mallard. I mean, he gives a scenario of what he thought the killer would do. Now, police are looking at something black and white. Somebody says, I think this is how they would do it, and they take it. And Lance Williams did admit to driving around at one time 60 times around. Well, police are going to see that as black and white. That's one and one. He's driving around. He's picking up women. Hello. He has to be, and he was an unusual character. So you can see the way a policeman would look at that, and that's the way it is, and we've seen it with a lot of other cases too. Now, up until now, if we hadn't heard these rape details, and you looked at purely on someone who was being accused and did not know the details about this horrific rape, you might look at it quite differently.
And Ali, Lance Williams died, passed away just...
from cancer a couple of years ago, yes. It was actually after Bradley Edwards was charged, because I remember thinking, at least he knows that it was somebody else that's been charged after all of this time.
Yeah.
So he was a very simple person.
Had you ever caught up with him? Did you see Mr. Williams after?
Oh, yeah.
You had spoken to him?
Yes. He was always very open and childlike. In a way. Certainly, he wanted me to stay. As I said, we stayed for a few hours. Well, I ran out of things to talk about after. He wanted to talk about the sunset. Very, very compulsive, like I moved the paper, he moved it back again, that sort of thing. Very, sort of like a compulsive disorder.
But you kept checking in on him for...
Oh, we did.
For years,
and he did. And he quite happily answered questions. And again, I once said to him, but aren't you upset about these police charges? He said, oh no, they're doing their job. So he was quite open, and
it's a positive outlook.
Totally,
isn't it? Positive
totally
outlook.
accepting.
And Ali, did you keep in contact with the victims' families over the years as well? Would they sometimes call you, or you would call them when little things would pop up?
Only the Glennons.
Yeah.
Spiers, we did for very intensively for that first year, and then I think it was getting too much.
There becomes a point when there's not much more to say,
No,
isn't there?
no. And I think he was wanting us to keep the story alive, and I do understand that. But there was a point when I'm saying we can't keep running this every night. And we'd find other ways for him to keep it alive by putting onto magazines and so forth. But it was such a long time and such a cold case, it does drift away.
And of course the tragedy
other
for
things
the
take
Spiers
over.
is that Sarah has never been found.
No.
So for that family, it's extraordinarily difficult.
Do you ladies think that the conversation in Western Australia has continued about the Claremont serial killers?
Yes.
So my question is, prior to 2016 when Mr. Edwards was charged, is it your view that the people of Western Australia had continued that conversation going for 20 years?
And people outside will still say what's happened with the Claremont.
Yeah.
Because it involved not only just the Claremont community, it involved everyone who drove a white van, everybody who had kids in the area, the whole taxi industry. They're all, we all gave our DNA. That involved thousands of people. And so it has been a very intriguing case that's kept alive all over the world. In fact, the calls that we're getting are people who were living in Claremont are now, in fact, the witnesses are all living elsewhere and still want to know what happened.
And this is why, we've got, thousands of people who are listening from the United States and listening from the United Kingdom because they've moved and they've taken that story with them.
They know the victims, they were
that's
friends,
right.
they went to the same school, they went to,
And really, for decades, we have waited for details, haven't we?
And it's very unusual for a cold case such as this one to suddenly come about. It's something like you'd see on Mindhunter or one of these programs, but for suddenly, so many years later, for it to very, very extraordinary.
It's surreal. It's actually surreal.
It is surreal.
And the point that I was making before is to have that Lance Williams experience, where you had a man with the finger pointed directly at him be, completely not charged and walked away from it.
They never charged him. In fact, sometimes I think maybe it was the media that was chasing him because the police never ever acknowledged that he was a suspect. They wouldn't comment at all. But we saw that car parked very openly every day on the main road down to the beach, sitting quite openly. And then they actually they went in and ripped the carpet up and put microphones in. But his parents just sort of talked about it this is what you do and this is what police do. And
it was interesting though because people had a take on that and some people had this mind that, well, since they've been tailing him, since they've been on surveillance, nothing else has happened. It must have been him. They just can't pin it.
No.
And so this was sort of one of the things that people would say for many, many years.
Exactly.
And on that point, that one of the things that resonates with me coming into the Christmas break is that it's just, and it's nothing to do with Mr. Edwards, but it did just stop. So these three people went missing.
That's right.
And then it just stopped.
Well, the prosecution says that's because he then resumed a normally happy life, because the prosecution's case is that Bradley Edwards is a Jekyll and Hyde, that to his colleagues and to his friends he's placid, he's unassuming, he doesn't drink that much, very, very even-tempered man, yet the prosecution says when something is a glitch in his personal life, he turns the other way and becomes a monster, a sex monster and a rapist and a possible killer. That's what their case is.
So then what they would be saying is that since the last of those three women went missing,
he resumed a normal.
Everything was perfect in his life. Well, that's.
Well,
does anyone live in perfection for that amount of time?
Well, somebody has. Well, there hasn't been any that we know of. I mean, we don't know. I mean, other women have gone missing, but there's not been...
Well, of course.
Yeah.
From other areas that maybe hasn't been attributed to this, of course, there's all those possibilities, isn't
There
there?
have been, like, Julie Cutler was mentioned, and there are other things that have been mentioned, but it was like with the Bernies, when they were going through, I remember a policeman saying that he'd gone down to David Burney and said, "Did you do this?" And David Burney said, "I can cop it if you want to. It doesn't mean anything to me, but then you'll have a cold-blooded killer out there." This was the words of David Burney, the serial killers that shot Perth previously. So you don't know whether there are others linked.
Do you still spend a fair bit of time in the Claremont area?
Every day.
And how do you feel there these days?
It's just my neighbourhood. I've never felt any different because, I felt differently when my kids were down there.
Yeah.
But no, it's my local area. I've lived there my entire life.
Yeah, well, and of course it brings us to where we are now, and this extraordinary situation. And as we keep saying in this podcast, there is nothing ordinary about this.
No, and more to come, huge
Yes.
amount to come. And that's where it's going to lie with the DNA. And the defence has been very quiet up until now, except when they did quite an intensive grilling yesterday with the police, evidence about how things were stored, how they were kept, photographed, logged, and there were some little inconsistencies
A
there.
precursor into the new year, perhaps.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for your personal insights. And I know for a lot of people, people particularly who lived in Western Australia, for some reason this case and this trial, it does feel personal to everybody. We all feel like we have a link, and we all feel like we have a really valid vested interest in it. So I think that's why people are just so keen for any kind of detail that they can get their hands on. So thank you both for sharing your thoughts on what it was like back then and how times have changed in Claremont. So we'll be back on the 6th of January when the trial resumes.
We will.
And so a short Christmas break for us. We'll be back then. And in the meantime, just keep an ear out or an eye out, because we will be dropping some bonus episodes of Claremont in Conversation, and we will see you back in the new year.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.